Welcome to Free2Disagree's Communal Sense podcast. My name is Amanda MacDonald, and today I have with me Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about the Impossible Conversations book that you guys have coming out. Or
It's
came
out.
out. Yeah, right. But first I wanted to ask why you wrote the book in general.
People aren't talking to each other very well anymore. The polarization in particular was a big concern. So you have people of different either political or religious or philosophical persuasions, and we observed that the quality of conversation across these divides or these aisles seemed to have downgraded a lot. We noticed that, for example, there's very little political capital to be gained by crossing an aisle. People are kind of holing up in their tribes on each side, and if you associate with the libs or you associate with conservatives, now you're a bad person. So nobody's really talking well. And so we thought it'd be good to write a guide to give people tools to talk across difference.
Yep.
So is there... I know we were talking a little bit last night about how the goal of the book and the goal of the Grievance Studies Affair kind of like dovetailed into each other.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we're having a difficult time talking, having conversations is a couple of things that come out of the Grievance Studies work that we did, where we wrote these papers examining social justice scholarship kind of in general. And among those are a strong motivation from that perspective not to have conversations. And then another is that people are redefining terms, so people don't understand each other very well, and then making everything intentionally political, kind of in the negative sense of the term, to where it's very difficult to agree or disagree. And so we felt like the scholarship that was informing that perspective, that ideological perspective, which is mostly present on the far left and kind of more into the middle left, really creates an impediment to conversation. And then the backlash that comes to that from the right creates a further impediment. They start calling it, oh, well, you're just part of the liberal agenda. And now all of us, conversation just starts breaking down.
Right.
So the idea kind of in both situations is to start generating conversations that reach across this camp versus that camp.
I noticed a little bit in the book, actually, it had specific sections. I think it was chapters 3 and 4, but it had particular sections in which you guys were talking about the changing of definitions and language.
Right.
I wanted to touch on that a little bit. How is it that we can have impossible conversations if the definitions of those conversations are constantly changing, whether that be from the political left or the right?
Yeah, I've changed my stance on that recently. So
Okay.
And I've made a lot of mistakes in conversations because what you think someone means by a word is not what they actually mean by the word. So you need to define those up front. But I just released a video in which it was a truly failed conversation, and I got a lot of grief for it. But I think it's important for transparency to show people that you make mistakes.
Yeah.
And words that are slippery like faith obviously need to be defined, but other words need to be defined as well, like border. What is a border? What you consider, so even simple words, and it's like two ships passing by each other in the night, you need to secure a definition, and usually I just go with whatever the definition is. But if you don't secure
the definition of the other person?
Well, yeah, it's just pretty much. I mean, if they define something that's just a very non-standard definition, that's fine too.
Right.
Because I now know what they mean by that, so then you can move forward.
Okay. Yeah, I was having a conversation a couple weeks ago about this, and a friend and I were talking, and it seemed like it was especially on the political left right now, there was kind of like this idea of oppositism going on.
Right.
Like they would kind of give you a word in some political context of whatever, and when you actually applied the word in conversation, it meant the complete opposite of what it was kind of intuitively meant to be.
Right.
And so I really found myself, it took me forever, like I was telling you guys this before, it took me forever to kind of figure out exactly what I was even talking about with people, because I couldn't I couldn't hammer down what the word actually meant. Like, do we use the dictionary definition of something? Do we use the theoretical understanding of a definition instead? And it seems like every time we do political theory, somebody's changing the definition of the word to kind of like match their political theory in the first place and kind of make it all flow together. I feel like it makes it more difficult to talk about that stuff.
My own, and you can chime in. Well, you want to?
I mean, that's unfortunately kind of a real challenge. So like Peter said, ideally what you want to do is try to get somebody to say, okay, well, what do you mean by that term? And we'll just agree. I'm not going to be combative with you. Just whatever you mean by that term, that's how we'll try to use it. Forgive me if I mess up. Okay. Ideally, you maybe can even ask, do you recognize that other people might use that word differently? And they're not wholly wrong because there are other meanings of it, but that can get contentious. But ultimately, unfortunately, what you often see with people that are deep in ideological positions, but in particular you see this with ones that are rooted in postmodern thought, is an almost intentional or strategic equivocation.
Exactly.
So they come up with, they mean something very specific by the term. I don't know if you've ever heard of the rhetorical strategy called a Mott and a Bailey, or Mott and Bailey rhetorical strategy. So take some work to describe what that is, but almost their entire plan is this. So the long and short is that back in the day when we had castles and the land around a castle, you have this field that's very nice. It might be a square mile in radius. That's called a bailey. There's lots of good places to live. You can farm it, so on, or whatever resources and township or whatever. It'll usually have something like a ditch or a moat or something like that around it that's somewhat defensible but not really defensible. And then there's usually a hill inside and then a castle on that hill that no one wants to live in. It's dank, it's dark, it's small, it's cramped, but it's sufficiently big to hold everybody who lives in that bailey. And it's basically invincible. It's extremely easy to defend. It's like a castle. You can go inside, you can shoot arrows out of it.
Right.
So if marauders come and they try to take over your field, maybe they get past the ditch and they can easily take that over, but your people can retreat into the motte and hide, and they can shoot arrows or whatever, and eventually the people trying to take over go away because they can't live there because they're getting shot with arrows.
Right.
all
It's
the
like a
time.
standoff.
Yeah. And so eventually the siege breaks and you can go back out and have your bailey back. And so as a rhetorical strategy, this is using two different definitions of the word. The one that you want to be able to pull off for a political purpose is the bailey. It's usually very expansive. It's usually false. And then the one that's very easy to defend is the motte, and so you can retreat to that. So, for example, one of the most easy to see ones is anybody who's familiar with what's going on under the name social justice is aware that there's a whole lot of very specific things going on, and it's very ideological, and you have to do this and you have to do that, and a lot of kind of control. But then when people say something about social justice, they say, well, it's just about treating people with respect.
Right.
We're just going to retreat to the, well, of course we want to treat people with respect.
Right.
Don't you want a more just society? That's retreating into the motte. And then the second there's no more pressure or examination on that idea, they're back to, well, you have to engage in a lifelong process of critical examination of your own thoughts and beliefs and even the way you use language and think, and be sorry for everything you've ever done, including being born, which is a bit more expansive. That's the Bailey thing.
Right.
And then again, they get pressed and you're like, oh, it's just about treating people with respect and making a more just society. So it turns out that postmodernism, and there's some really great paper that came out in 2005 by, I'm going to mess it up. His last name's Shackle. It might be William, maybe not. His last name is Shackle in any case. It's 2005, and he talks about the vacuity of postmodern logic, and it is actually a intentional postmodern strategy to facilitate between those two definitions, the desired, blow your mind one, everything you ever thought is wrong or very politically applicable, and then to shrink back to a really easily defended one. So there's genuinely a problem there that I think is what you're touching on.
Yeah.
That how do you have an impossible conversation with somebody who's not using their terms even not even just whether it's good faith or bad faith, but not even using their terms in a consistent way.
Right.
And
exactly.
This is kind of Peter's realm of expertise more than mine, but he has an uncanny ability to start asking the kinds of questions that show that most people, even though their philosophy may not rely on consistency, the way they live their life still relies on an awful lot of consistency. So he's really good at asking questions like, well, how would that same mindset apply in some other, mundane example in your life? and all of a sudden it, can reveal that it's a Socratic approach that reveals the contradiction. And
is this the section of the book where you're talking about the disconfirmation questions?
Well, it's throughout the book, but there's a piece on that in chapter 6. But so my question to you is, my speculation to that is because people don't believe at core. I can't believe you're drinking at this hour of the day. That is indeed impressive.
Thank you. It's Colorado.
Yeah. Right. I think that they believe at core that their beliefs are not rationally derivable. And if they were rationally derivable, then they wouldn't need any strategy. They would just say what their belief was and then throw all their cards on the table. But at some level, if you don't think reason is univocal or the positions you hold, particularly the moral positions, every rational person would assent to them, then you have to play games, right? You have to do some kind of linguistic gymnastics or expand the semantic range of a word, or you have to do something, right? Because if you wouldn't need to do any of that stuff, you could just present your idea and clearly show how you got it.
Right.
But if you can't do that, then you need to do something to forward that idea.
Right. So what are kind of like best practices then to go ahead and forward some kind of idea that is going to reach across the aisle and make some kind of political sense? So if I'm talking to somebody who's like a critical race theory person,
right,
and I'm trying to say something along the lines of, I think, critical race theory doesn't work and these are the reasons why.
Right. So that's already a mistake.
Because you can't
It's
just say
already
it
a
doesn't
mistake
work.
because that's delivering a message.
delivering a message.
Oh, right.
and you
Yeah,
can't
we talked
deliver a
about
message.
that in the book.
So the book is designed, I think there are 36 techniques in the
Yes.
book, and it goes from, fundamental, basic, intermediate, advanced, expert, and master. And yeah, sure, you could start in the middle of the book, but it won't do you any good. You have to start from the beginning. What's your goal of being in the conversation?
Right.
What's someone's claim? How do they define words? What do they mean? And then you need to, version of Rappaport's rules, you need to repeat that back to them in such a way that is,
Like Steel Manning it, for example.
Yeah, like they said, wow, that's really good. I wish I would have thought of that. And from the hostage negotiation stuff, you want to get that's right. So every time I get that's right, I know that I've gotten it. So once you get that, and the techniques in the book work best when they come bundled in suites of techniques. Like you go from beginning to later. And some people think that they can just drop some of the techniques later on in the book. I guess you can, but it's not going to work.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem is that we don't understand what other people think. And if you think to yourself, oh, if they only had this one data point, if they had this one piece of information, they wouldn't believe that way. Well, we know that's not true because people have those data points. The problem is what constitutes sufficient evidence for you to warrant belief in a claim is very different from what constitutes sufficient evidence for me. And so those data points don't do the work, and that's why we also advocate in the book, and there's overwhelming evidence for this. And this is the one thing that there's no way I can convince people to do this. It's almost impossible. It's just you don't provide evidence you don't give evidence unless you're explicitly asked to give evidence.
Yeah, it said something like stay away from the facts or don't use facts.
Yeah, because then you're just delivering messages.
Right.
But people don't form their beliefs on the basis of evidence if it has a moral valence or if it's some kind of an identity marker, identity level salience. So they won't do it. So you providing evidence for someone, if you're not asked, is just going to dig someone deeper in a cognitive sinkhole.
Right. Because they're gonna try to automatically defend against the evidence that's given.
Exactly right. It invokes a defensive posture.
Right.
And that they lead themselves into reinforcing their beliefs.
Yeah.
So best practice is actually to ask questions.
Yeah.
So, they say something about critical race theory and you don't think it works. And so the best question in the universe to ask is, how does that work?
Right.
Right.
And ask for details. And when they start trying to, we call it the unread library effect.
I was just
going to
ask about that.
There's this cognitive illusion that cognitive scientists have found. It's called the illusion of explanatory depth. And a lot of times people think they know something a lot better than they actually know it.
Right.
And if you start asking them to explain the details, most people eventually hit a point where they can't explain the details anymore, and they kind of, I don't know, and they feel awkward and self-conscious. At the second they feel awkward and self-conscious because they know they're not adequately explaining what they're saying, they've hit that open-minded space where they're going to have to do something either to try to fill in that gap or to possibly change the belief that they have.
Right.
And so asking the question, what the cognitive scientists showed was that if you ask questions until people become aware that they don't know it as well as they thought they did, that this has an effect of moderating the strength of their belief. So
even political beliefs.
Yeah,
so
even
they'd be
political
like
beliefs.
more open to receiving suggestion from somebody else to be able to alter the
suggestion
belief.
or alternative ideas, or
Right.
even just to go rethink it on their
Yeah,
own, depending on the context.
Right.
Yeah.
So they might follow it up with, well, how do you think it should work? And then you can start talking about your perspective if you want. Or they may not, in which case it's better to just go let them work it out for themselves a little bit and
Right.
wallow in their spot. But what they realized was, if people are, 8 out of 10 confident, like I'm really sure, I'm not
Scales,
totally
you just
sure.
use scales.
I'm really sure this is how this works. And then you have them, and you're pretty sure it's not, and you have them explain it in detail, and you just keep asking, just genuinely, I really want to, okay, I'm going to just assume
Just be
you're
the
right,
gadfly in the
but I
conversation.
want to see how it works. So how is this going to get applied, and what happens when it gets applied, and who's going to pay for that, and where
And
do
there
we
are
get the money?
techniques that you can use even to elicit that.
Right. And so when you go through that and they hit that point where they're like, man, I don't know how this, what? I
I'm
don't
not
know.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. When they hit that, a lot of times, like if they had an 8 out of 10 confidence in that belief, it might drop to 6 or 5. And this has been, confirmed by good cognitive science.
Yeah, everything in the book,
Science evidence.
I think 35 of 36 techniques are all evidence-based, steeped in a mountain of literature, and one is just...
One is just for
It's
fun.
a bit experimental.
I think we call it an experimental technique.
We actually thought about making another chapter for experimental techniques, but we decided not to go way out on any limbs. And
Yeah, that's probably safe considering the ones that you're using are so concrete. It might
Totally based in evidence.
might push
100%.
people into like the wrong,
There
ruining
are
conversation.
multiple domains of thought: hostage negotiation, cult exiting, motivational interviewing, drug and alcohol treatment, applied epistemology, rooted in Socratic pedagogy. I mean, the whole
cognitive
thing.
science.
Cognitive science.
Psychology,
It's just brings
marketing, sales.
marketing, sales. It just brings together disparate and totally unrelated elements. Should we give shorter answers and you just bang off the questions?
No, I'm loving this actually.
Okay, cool.
So James introduced scales, and we were talking before how disconfirmations and scales are
Disconfirmation,
the two
money,
biggest.
nukes. They're nukes.
Why are they nukes? How?
Okay, so before I say that, I just have to stress again.
Okay.
You can't just walk around starting asking people disconfirmation questions unless you know what they believe.
Right. You have to do the first
You
rapport
have
rules
to
first.
do this, and we say repeatedly in the book, please do not jump to the advanced step, because everybody will think that they've already done sufficient life homework to I can do this, but no, the fact is not. Okay, so a scale is just, it took me forever to figure this out. Okay, so most people will have a level of confidence in which they hold a particular belief.
All right, and they never think about that.
Right.
Most people never think that how confident they are in their belief is relevant or matters. They don't even reflect upon it. So
Right.
even the question, how confident are you in your belief?
That's like a
already
mind turner
starts-
already.
Yeah. So you can use scales in any one of a number of ways. The beginning of conversation, once you got it, how confident are you in that belief? On a scale from 1 to 10. Now, if they don't want to put it in a scale, you can figure that out. But let's say that they say 8. Boom. You know exactly what questions to ask after that. Now, the other thing you can do with scales is you can post-test them. That's a pre-test at the end of the conversation. Say how confident. That shows how if you're effective in giving them the gift of doubt. I also impose scales on myself in these, so I can see if I've changed my result. If someone knows something I don't know, I want to know what
Right.
it is. And so then I can recalibrate my confidence. So that's one thing. The second thing we write in the book is if someone says, well, we live in a patriarchy. Okay, well, like how much of a patriarchy? Put it on a scale. Say Saudi Arabia is 9 on the patriarchy.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
Yeah. So if they say, then we're 10, they're totally delusional, right?
Right.
So, or they don't know I don't know anything about Saudi Arabia. Okay, so say the United States in the 1950s. If they're like 7 on a patriarchy, where are we now? So you can figure out what someone means. If they give an example of that of 2, okay, well maybe, I don't know, maybe it's
Right.
2. So that's
That seems
within the
reasonable
realm
at
of
least.
reasonability, right? So but when you really get advanced with scales,
Well, that's because people often take things as binary when they're actually, graded.
Right.
It's,
Yeah.
Is there water in the cup or not? Well, that's a binary. And then you could actually say, well, it's, 80% full or whatever.
Right.
And so, how much water is in the cup is a different way to look at the same question about water in there. So if the question is somebody says, well, the United States is a patriarchy.
Right.
It really is relevant to say how bad
Right.
is this problem.
Right.
Right.
And let's compare it to examples that we know are worse to kind of gauge what you believe about the world.
Which is the other thing, that you have to give people the benefit of the doubt. Like
Right, 'cause people
you
will
can't
just-
start with the least charitable interpretation.
Right. You have
Right.
to give them the best.
The best interpretation.
Right.
But you can do some incredibly cool things with scales. Like, so say, how confident are you that we should, build a wall? It doesn't matter what it is. And he says, well, I'm 8 confident in that on a scale from 1 to 10. So, that's really interesting because I'm a 4 confident in that. Can you show me?
Get me to an 8.
Yeah, like how do I get to an 8? So what they do is that they then give kind of the details for those beliefs.
It invites them to give those details.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they explain their epistemology in a way that doesn't invoke a defensive posture.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an unbelievably effective tool. But when you combine that with disconfirmation, okay, so
then you're totally sidestepping all the way the yes it is, no it's not, yes it is, no it's not.
Right.
no-
I
none of
hate
that.
that.
Right.
Right.
So you don't. Once you've done that, if you're in that situation, you've already made a mistake. It's like,
Or that should be your cue. Oh, well, we need to put a scale on this. And maybe you
Right.
can collaborate with the person you're talking with. Like, okay, wait a minute. We need to figure, there's a scale here. You're saying yes, I'm saying no. Maybe the case is it's more or less, not total, but not empty. Let's
Right.
try to figure out
Yeah.
a number that fits in the middle. And then you collaboratively look. So that would combine with the synthesis technique near the end of the book.
that's right. Yeah. And so you want to go into disconfirmation?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
absolutely.
important.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I think that's one of the big. I've been doing this for over a quarter century. I think this is one of the most important things in my whole career. The thing that I have learned the most. So, and I think this is going to be a heresy. I think we're doing it wrong. I think asking people for evidence front loaded, given that we just talked about what constitutes evidence for you may not be constitute evidence for
Right.
me. So the problem with asking people for evidence and such is once they give you their evidence, they're hearing themselves talk and they're calibrating their confidence up as they speak.
And they're also looking for evidence that is consistent with what they believe. So
Right, they're
confirmation
confirming
bias
themselves and further
desirability bias.
Exactly.
come into play.
Exactly. That's exactly.
Scientists don't think in terms of confirmation. They think in terms of disconfirmation.
Right.
Whether it's rigorous, if it's science, it's falsifiability is what they call it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something in a more philosophical realm, they call it defeasibility.
Right.
Mathematicians, I'm a mathematician. If I were to say, such and such mathematical property is true, the first question I can tell you I'd be asked is, well, what's the proof? And if I say, well, I don't know the proof, they'll say, well, do you know any counterexamples?
Right.
Did you look for counterexamples? That's the first thing. I think such and such is true. Are
And-
there any counterexamples?
Yeah, and that's why.
So disconfirmation is how you get to truth, because that which survives being disconfirmed is more likely to be true, not
Right.
that which you can always you can think of like people's beliefs as kind of like putty or Play-Doh, and they can take the evidence of the world, like a mountain or whatever, and just bend the putty around it
Right.
and shape their beliefs around what evidence they want or have or are willing to count or discount. When you start asking them, well, what would make that false? You put them in a completely different paradigm of
Yeah,
thought that
'cause they're not
happens to
building
be
anymore.
the one that works for science, the one that works for rigorous mathematics, the one that works for rigorous philosophy, as opposed to some dude sitting in his armchair like, I think this is how the world works.
Yeah, so taking a step back from that the disconfirmation question is, how could that belief be false? I'm not saying it is false, right? So you don't want to invoke a defensive posture.
Right.
I'm just like, what conditions would have to hold for that to be false? And most people just simply never ask that question. In fact, almost no one has asked that question. They're asked, why do you believe that? What's your evidence for that? In other words, right?
And then people are citing studies and studies
Yeah,
and
but-
studies just entrenching
and then they're
themselves.
just calibrating their confidence.
And
on
it's
it.
actually how our brains work. Our brains work to look for confirmation.
Exactly.
But we have learned the hard way, and only pretty recently in human history, that you have to look the other way if you want to get to true beliefs.
Right. So, if anybody is a philosophy major or seriously interested in conversation or political science or what have you, it's not then asking somebody how they know that as a bad question. That's a totally reasonable question. In fact, it's a necessary question. But I would advocate making that a secondary question. The primary question, once, of course, you've figured out what someone believes and, this is the claim, this is what I mean by this word, et cetera, is to immediately ask a disconfirmation question. Oh, so what? So then you can just avoid all those problems. So then you say, okay, well then, and so there are 3 things people can give you. Again, the cool thing about the book is that it just lays everything out in a template. Like they say this, you say this, they say this, you say this. You don't have to do any work at all. We've done all the work for you. We've done everything. This is,
Yeah, I love that it goes through, like you explain whatever example you're talking about, and then you give ways in which you can formulate the question to make this rule apply.
Yeah.
And it's super easy to read. That was like the easiest book I've read in a while.
Thanks.
I love it.
So we've done that work for you. So there's no reason to, if you want to bake a cake, you don't just start throwing eggs and flour and shit in a pan. You just, you follow a recipe. We've given you the recipe for what you need to do. So there are only 3 things that people can say to you. There's literally, well, there are 4, but we don't talk about the 4th in the book because it's less relevant. The 4th is, I don't know what it would take. Okay, so bracket that. So let's talk about the 3.
Okay.
They can tell you what it would take for this is the ideal situation. This is what it would take for me to believe we don't need 100,000 immigrants. We need, 500,000 or no immigrants or no wall or higher wall. It's totally irrelevant what it is.
Right.
Okay, then you can have that conversation.
Yeah, there's a really famous example from back when the scientists were fighting the creationists. Well, what would it take for you to throw away the theory of evolution? It's a single fossil of a rabbit in the Precambrian.
That's exactly correct.
Find that, it's all crap.
Precambrian rabbit. That's right. Right. So that's an example of disconfirmation. But, okay, so now we're talking about evidence. So now I know what it takes. So I don't need to provide any evidence. I don't need to deliver any messages. I don't need to do anything. You've already told me what it takes. Then we can have a conversation about that. The second thing they could tell you is, well, there's no evidence. There's no evidence. There's nothing that's going to change my mind.
Yeah, like that guy you were talking about, Ham, in the book.
In the book.
Yeah.
So I think Tracy Moody asked him a question. I think this was my first book. What would it take to change? It was just confirmation question. He's like, well, there's no evidence. Okay, well, it's great. Then this whole thing is a charade because you don't formulate your beliefs on the basis of evidence. So the thing to say to someone is, at that point, oh, that's interesting. So that belief, notice how I didn't say you, that belief is informed on the basis of evidence. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, formulating a belief on the basis of evidence means there must be some piece of evidence that could come in that would cause one to change one's mind, right? And if they're less educated, you don't say one. You could say you.
A person or something.
Yeah, person.
You want to stay
like
out of the you thing.
Yeah, because again, that's like a defensive posture.
You don't want defense. That's the golden rule of this whole thing. That's why we talk about the and stance, not but, etc. Okay, so then if they say to you, they could say a few things to you. It's like, well, you're right. It's not formed on the basis of evidence. Okay, great. Now it's formed because it makes me, I feel better in my life. I believe this and I feel better. Okay, great.
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
But we all know where you stand now too.
Yeah.
So.
Right, exactly.
And that's why I firmly believe that we need to thank people when they tell us what they actually believe. And I've gotten mad hell for that. Someone says, yes, we want to kill apostates. Well, thank you for, being honest about what you believe.
Right.
We should always thank people for being honest about what they believe. You're going to go to hell. Thank you. I appreciate you being. I don't agree, but I appreciate. This is someone with whom you can have a conversation, right?
Right. Thanks for showing me like what counterpoint I'm talking to.
Yeah, it's not like, oh well, I don't know about this, and stoning women for adultery. Well, Muhammad. No. Should women be stoned for adultery? Yeah, absolutely. Kill them. Chop their heads off. Boom. Okay, thank you. I appreciate your fact that you're honest with me about that.
Right. Otherwise, you're entrenching a virtue of kind of hiding what you believe, and you can't have honest conversations if people are hiding what they believe.
So then the third thing is that someone could give you a totally absurd disconfirmation criterion.
Oh, this is the alien in the truck thing.
Yeah, the beer. You did read the book read it detailed. Yeah.
Yes, I did.
We give the example of. Oh, and by the way, just parenthetically, we wrote a paper about these notions about a doxastic landscape. Mm-hmm. That paper has gotten rejected. Ever since we came out with the Grievance Studies stuff, none of my peer-reviewed and our peer-reviewed stuff has gotten accepted. It's all been rejected now. So I don't think...
Just because of your name's on there.
Yeah, I think so. They think it's a hoax, or they're like, screw these guys or whatever, so I can't write peer-reviewed papers anymore. But anyway, right? I mean, I just think that... It's just books from here on in. But so then it could be some wild. So they know at some point that I'd have to ask every Mexican. I'd have to have the papers of everyone from Syria. Their medical records. Their no possible way that you could get. The whole ministries or what have you been bombed. People have nothing. Come on.
Right.
So there are additional psychological reasons why someone would offer that as a disconfirmation criteria. But then what you do from there is it's a chart, it's a roadmap. Everything is guided for you once you get the answer to the disconfirmation question. You know how the conversation proceeds.
Right.
Right.
You have some pretty good insight into their cognitions at that point. And
Right.
what direction you kind of have to go. If somebody's giving you a wildly implausible disconfirmation criterion, probably you're not going to end up agreeing, for example.
Right.
You're going to end up
Yeah.
switching to listening. And then, as we were saying a second ago, well, hopefully you can get them to say that they believe its evidence isn't really the
Yeah.
consideration here. And then
Yeah, so
thank you
there's
for saying so,
something
and-
else,
Right.
like belief, and belief is Dan Dennett calls like a moral thing. But what's interesting, they give you a wildly implausible disconfirmation criteria, and usually those people will set the scales at 10, 9, 9. It gets weird when they set the scale of their belief at like 7, because something is amiss in Denmark. Like something's not right there.
Right.
So the idea is, if you bundle these techniques together, the likelihood that conversation will be far more effective depending on what your goal is. You'll understand epistemology, why they believe what they believe.
Right.
Does what they believe get them to their premises, get to them to their conclusion? Do they know something that I don't know? Should you take that in and calibrate your belief, the confidence in your beliefs down? Should you, because that's the highest level of this stuff. It's not to change someone else's mind. It's to
Change your
use,
own.
it's to use what they say to refine your beliefs so that you have fewer false beliefs. Not necessarily more true beliefs, but fewer false beliefs. That just gives you more bang for the buck if you think about, I'm going to clean up my belief life, not by going out and trying to believe true stuff, but by ceasing to believe things that are not sufficiently warranted by the evidence.
So, talking about things that aren't sufficiently warranted by the evidence, at the very end of the book, you start talking about, this is like the expert level stuff, obviously.
Yeah.
You start talking about how it is that we can talk to an ideologue, and how it is
Right.
that we know that we're talking to an ideologue.
Right.
And I wanted to touch on that a little bit, because in my experience, especially if I'm like on campus or if I'm on social media, so this could also be like a question about how to interact on social media, which you also talked about more in the beginning of the book.
Right.
But how do we know when we're talking to an ideologue, and how do we kind of facilitate a constructive conversation with somebody who is an ideologue? How do you kind of step back or understand when, hey, I need to leave this conversation because this isn't going
Okay,
anywhere?
so that's a lot of things you just said there.
Yeah, there's like
you
a whole-
have to always be willing and ready and able to walk away, right? That's vital. And I was telling my students today, I don't recommend anybody has conversations with an ideologue, but there are times where you just kind of have to, like you're at your girlfriend's house for Thanksgiving or whatever, and their parents are fucking lunatics, right? So that there's some kind of, 10 on to use what we talked about before, 10 on the disconfirmation scale.
Yeah, they
Probably.
can't leave it alone. They just keep bringing it up.
They
Right.
just will not let it die. They just will not let it go. So in those kind of situations, if you're trapped, you have to be able to, it is empowering to you to know what to do, as opposed to just, frankly, being self-delusional and thinking that this is never going to happen to you, right? Because it's going to happen to almost all of us, if not all of us, at least once over the course of the next year, especially in this
I was just going
environment.
to say, because the elections are coming up and everything, it's going to be crazy.
Right, with the Trump mania everywhere. Okay, so one of the ways that you converse with an ideologue is the first order of business is to figure out if that's you.
Right.
Right. So because you could be thinking, oh my God, this person's an ideologue, but you could be the ideologue. So are there disconfirmation criteria for your beliefs? Are you a 10 on the scale? Do you feel that your belief is warranted, and on what basis? Are you willing to change your mind? And in the American Philosophical Association's Delphi report, which we talk about in the book, belief revision is the core tenet, or one of the core principles of an ideal critical thinker. And if you really drill down on that, what makes an ideal critical thinker isn't primarily, inferences, analysis, etc. These are attitudinal dispositions that one has. Are you trustful of reason? Are you willing to reconsider your beliefs? And ideologues, to a person, fail miserably on those. Again, coupled with disconfirmation, that they're just not willing to change their beliefs. So how do you navigate that reality?
Right.
And so we recommend in the book, we took Jonathan Haidt's work and we made it the practical application of that. harm versus fairness, and we can go into that. But does that answer your general question about an orientation of why one would want to do this, and before we drill down into the specifics, or no?
Yeah. I think that I think that adequately answers kind of what I'm getting at. Like, why would you want to talk to an ideologue, and am I that ideologue?
Yeah, and
I think that's
especially I would imagine in political science that would, anything practical in the world or anything that has implications in the world, that would be important. And so then we talk about why certain issues are more difficult than others. And again, the book just has templates. We just lay out, they say this, you say this, they say this. And I just want to take a moment to say, when you first start this, be a fundamentalist. Don't sway, don't do anything, don't improvise. But after you've done this, few conversations, you're feeling good under your belt, you feel you got chapter 2 down, chapter 3 down, then if you know about history or you have a really good sense of humor, then you can start adding those things. Right. But just until you get that, use that as a base for those conversations. That's like I was thinking of the Ankh from Logan's Run. I don't know where that came from, but like kind of that's kind of a mantra, like the thing that you come back to, that you then spring from.
Yeah, those first rules about the goals and everything like that, and the rapport rules. So, it's difficult for me when I'm talking to people because I often can't tell the difference between when I'm talking to an ideologue and when I'm talking to somebody who's passionate, especially like on the internet, for example, if I'm on Facebook or Twitter, and I find myself getting into these awkward conversations where they want me to actually provide them evidence, like they'll ask for it, kind of like we were talking about earlier. And then if I give them some kind of evidence, they're like, actually, I don't agree with that evidence because of the source that it comes from.
So there's already the thing. So they asked you to provide evidence. There's an intermediary step there. Is what do you think is sufficient evidence?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it going to be the Scientific American?
It's sort of the George Costanza moment. What do you want to hear?
Right.
Yeah.
He gets put in some awkward position, and George, did you just whatever it was, and what do you want to hear? But it's not quite like that. But it is, if somebody asks you for evidence, if you just start rattling things off, chances are they're ready to start going into, well, I've already thought about that, and I've already thought that's not good, and this and that.
That's not evidence.
And that's
he's biased, and
and that came from the wrong source, and blah 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 blah. And so, what works as evidence for you is so that we don't waste each other's time here. What kind of things?
That's key too.
What kind of things would work for you? Maybe I have that, maybe I don't, but and if I don't, I'll just admit it and see what happens from there.
Right.
This is where a lot of conversations that are going pretty well click off the rails. Is it starts being that well, I do want to know your evidence. Then as soon as they hear their evidence, it's I don't want to hear your evidence anymore.
Right. So the intermediate question, and he's absolutely correct, is this is a tremendous time saver. So instead of you sitting there doing careful research or here it is. Oh, that's interesting. Again, no defensive posture. What do you think would constitute evidence? Like what sources would you? Then you've saved yourself a tremendous amount of time because you were just going to include those sources, so you just include the sources.
Yeah, so if they give you something that's ridiculous, like, well, if you could find me a critical race theorist who disagrees with critical race theory, then I would say critical race theory is wrong. Well, at that point, you're like, aha. So this person, whether they're an ideologue, whether they're passionate, whatever it is, they are now in an orbit of that belief that is closed. They're not coming out of that. Right. So whatever label you want to give to them doesn't matter. But at that point, you realize that you're working with somebody who is working within kind of a very closed belief system.
Right.
And your options for what you can achieve with that conversation start to change. Listen, learn, try to get them to explain it till they get their own little bit of doubt. My favorite, I think the most important technique in the book for our time right now is let your friends be wrong.
I was going to ask you guys about that. I think that's a great piece of advice. A lot of people lost friends in like the 2016 election. Some people lost marriages over it.
Yeah.
I think that it's brilliant to allow somebody the idea like you can just be wrong. It's okay.
Yeah, and everybody wants ideological congruity, which I kind of get, but there's this weird kind of Puritanism or something. There's this weird like, oh, he didn't believe exactly what I believe, therefore, whatever insane conclusion one comes to. Well, who gives a shit?
We can't even be friends now.
Yeah, that's
just
like the
let people be
discourses
wrong.
you were talking about last night, where it's actually within the discourses, and once you kind of deviate from those discourses, you find yourself kind of being ostracized by the rest of the
Right, right.
community.
That's right.
Yeah. It's been the single most helpful thing for me coming out of my, I guess, more firebrand days as, liberal atheist. And most of my friends, being that I live in the South and I do martial arts, are conservatives and libertarians.
Right.
Just not arguing with them at all. They bring up some stuff and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me how you think that works. And we talk about it for a few minutes. They feel happy because they share their beliefs. I'm like, well, thanks for telling me something I hadn't thought about before. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'll go think about it and let you know. And then I don't ever actually have to do that. Like, let them know. We can just drop it if it's like, that kind of a thing. Or I can go ponder it and have a further, deeper conversation about it later if it's not likely to be a nuclear bomb in our relationship.
Right.
Yeah,
just let people be wrong.
The
It's
key
okay.
there is that people, it's amazing, they just want to be listened to.
A lot of people do.
Yeah.
One of the things, and this is kind of applied to almost everything we've been talking about for the last few minutes, 10, 15 minutes probably, is that conversations happen on a multitude of levels at once psychologically, and most of us never think about that. This comes out of research that was done in the Harvard Negotiations Project.
Okay.
And they realized that at least three levels are always operative. They call the three levels what happened, emotional, and identity. And so
Oh, that's brilliant.
when we start talking, everybody floats around up in this what happened, which is the descriptive, logical reason, blah, blah, blah level. What's your evidence, blah, blah. Well, if the reality is that the deeper the level goes, the more powerful the motivations are, but also it tends to be the more hidden they can be. People aren't as aware of them. So maybe it's an emotional thing. Maybe they're genuinely afraid. Like, maybe it's the immigration thing. Well, what if we let in a whole bunch of people and they're dangerous or it might bankrupt us, and they're afraid of the outcome? That's an emotional reaction. You can't logic your way past an emotion.
Right.
And what they talk about is that you have to be able to ask the right kinds of questions to get down to that and then talk through the emotion. And maybe you're competent or qualified to do that. Maybe you're not. But as a conversationalist, as any, everyday conversationalist, it's good to keep that in mind. That might be actually what's going on. When it gets to identity level stuff, it's even worse.
Right.
And that usually manifests in that, well, if I believe differently, I would be a bad person.
Right, exactly. And
Right.
that's key
And
that
you
we talk about in the book.
cannot bump around, if I believed otherwise, I would be a bad person.
Right.
There's and to drill down into that and change that that's a process. You have to have closeness, rapport, friendship, intimacy, trust, and time. That's a thing that would happen over the span of months or years of repeated conversations with a lot of closeness. And if you're going to blow that up because you want to fight about the details, you got no chance in changing that.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
But being aware that those other psychological levels are going on is absolutely critical. When you're talking to an ideologue, it is almost always the case that it's now identity level.
Right.
They have identified with their set of beliefs and genuinely believe that you are a bad person if you don't believe them. And not to Freud people, because it's not fair to psychologize what's going on, but they are projecting in many cases. They want to consider you a bad person because they figure that if they accepted those same kind of beliefs, it would make them a bad person. And it's a very uncomfortable thing to face. I'm not saying that any average person who's going to pick up and read our book is going to be competent to dive down into identity level issues. But if you create that, as they call it, what is it, aporia at the top level?
Wonder.
You get that gift of doubt and you make them wonder that maybe something's amiss here. Maybe my thoughts don't line up. They actually can start working through some of that deeper stuff. They also can there's a relationship thing going on here too. At some point, people want to understand the people that they like. So if you're going to make your conversations really contentious and argumentative and nasty, they have no draw to try to understand your perspective. So the earlier techniques in the book of building rapport and maintaining rapport, let your friends be wrong. Why? Because the friendship matters more.
Right. And extending an umbrella of charity.
Exactly.
Right.
That's under Rappaport's rules as well.
Like participating in good faith with somebody if you're going to have a conversation
and
with them.
also not assuming the person is acting out of a bad place.
Right. Like what we said is if you're going to make any assumptions about the motivations of the person you're talking to, there's only one assumption you should ever make about their motivations. They're better than you think they are. If you disagree with somebody, chances are they have good motivations. And if you think that, only an evil person could think that or whatever, especially if you get to that far, chances are they actually have good motivations. They may not be able to articulate that. So if you want to be the one who's going to be successful as a conversationalist, it's going to be your job. Even if you have to end the conversation now and say, I'm going to go mull this over. This is getting a bit hot.
Yeah.
Let's come back to it after I have a chance to think about it. I'm missing something. I've got to figure it out. Just put it all on yourself, and then really do go think about it.
Don't just tell them, then leave the conversation and never come back to it.
Yeah, and if you can drill down into the way that they could, you want to go think for yourself, how could they be motivated by the best possible intentions? And when you figure that out, now you're in a new paradigm. We were talking about for a little while, I even called that, what did I call it? Manual empathy. You can generate, you can almost do, empathy is, a feeling that I can relate to your experience or whatever. I feel what you feel. You can generate that intentionally by trying to find the good intentions behind that person that put them in that frame of mind. And you can genuinely start to think and feel the way they do. And you can ask yourself, well, if I genuinely did think and feel that way, what would I think? And once you hit that, now you're going to have a connection point, and your next conversation with that person is going to be way better.
Right, because you're going to be able to kind of like empathize with them on a different level and say something along the lines of, okay, I totally understand you now, and we can actually like kind of hash out this little piece.
Yeah, I mean, the old wisdom there was, put yourself in their shoes, right?
Right.
Well, it turns out that it takes work. You can't just,
I'm in your shoes.
Yeah, you actually have to go. There's something there that has to be done. And you are the one who has to do it, because you can't rely on that other person you're speaking with to do anything. A lot of people get frustrated because they're like, well, I'm doing all this work and they're not doing their end. No, they don't have an end.
Exactly.
If you want to have a successful conversation with somebody, you can only change you.
Right.
So you have to put that on yourself.
And you have to listen first.
Right.
Right? You can't, I want to be listened to. Okay, great. Everybody wants to be listened to.
Right.
So that's the modeling we talk about in the book.
Yeah.
Right.
So you need to listen first.
Yeah, you need to be able to model the conversation how you want it, and then that person will mimic your behavior, and you can have something constructive.
And you can't expect exactly what Jim said.
Yeah. You can't expect them to do it. You have to do your share. And sometimes it works, and that's great, and sometimes it doesn't work, and let your friends be wrong.
Exactly.
And what are your goals? Your goal at some point should always be some level of maintain the relationship or enhance the relationship. If it's somebody that you have any level of rapport with. If it's just some random person on the internet, I guess it doesn't matter. But
right. So, like, speaking of the people on the internet that you actually talk to, in the book it says something about how these techniques are the best used when you're talking face-to-face with somebody.
And even beyond that, face-to-face, one-to-one.
Right.
Yeah.
So how is it that if you're going to, like you mentioned this in the book also, if you get on social media, there's sometimes like a third party that kind of comes in and riles everything up, because it's really not a conversation between two people. Right. Whenever it's on the internet, it's a conversation between two people in the internet.
And people will say something anonymously that they would never say.
Right. And somebody, when they say something publicly, will then dig their heels into that because they said it publicly.
And that's
from
the hostage negotiation thing. You want to build golden bridges, which we write about in the book.
Yeah,
and
that was
give
like in the first
people
part.
Opportunity to save face.
Yeah, what you can actually do is send a private message. The second you see that dynamic on social media getting weird, send let's say maybe it's Twitter, you're 3 exchanges in with somebody, then some random jumps in and says, well, what about blah, 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 or whatever.
Or something even worse.
Yeah, or something terrible. And so you could, at any point, you can either invite the person publicly, can we talk about this in private instead, or if their direct messages are open, or if you can message them on Facebook or whatever platform you're using, you can send a private message and say, look, I don't think this is going to go well in public. Can we continue this in private? Maybe they say yes. Maybe
I should have asked
no.
if I could put my feet up. Can I put my feet up?
I mean, it's already done now.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that.
Nicely done, Peter.
Nice.
Yeah, so I had some other questions about the acknowledge extremist stuff.
Right.
I thought that was really important to hit on because I also find frequently throughout conversation on the internet, especially, it's, if you like or dislike Trump, and then the response is usually, well, what about Obama? Or what about, exactly, the whataboutism, the what about this extremist over here that you have on your side. And I thought that was kind of like a useful thing to talk about, acknowledging the extremists on your own side and kind of saying,
don't expect reciprocity.
Yeah.
Don't expect because you acknowledge some lunatics on your side broadly, political, moral, etc., that you're owed them to disavow extremists on their side.
Yeah,
you're not owed anything.
That's
Right.
another good test for yourself to figure out if you're the ideologue. Because if you can't figure out people who are too extreme on your side of the argument, you might be that extreme pole or part of it. So you always want to, be cognizant that whatever belief it is can be taken too far, and that you really should try to put some daylight between you and the people who are genuinely taking it too far.
Right.
And then it builds a lot of comfort when you start talking across a divide. As we were just saying, the one thing you should assume about your partner's motivations is that they're better than you think they are.
Right.
Right.
Well, what's the inverse of that? Is that the person, I guess that's maybe, I don't remember my logic, is it the contrapositive? The person probably believes you have worse motivations than you really do.
Right.
So they say, you're on the right, I'm on the left or whatever, and we start disagreeing on something. It's really easy to start thinking, oh, crap, he's a social justice warrior.
Yeah.
Oh, it's one of those,
It's an immediate rapport builder, too.
one of those complete lunatic conservatives that, alt-right or whatever it happens to be. And it's just so easy to push the person that you're talking with artificially way off too far. And so one thing you can do to generate trust across that divide that still exists is to say, look, I'm 100% with you that the people, like the social justice lunatics, are way too far. I care about this, I care about that, we disagree about this policy or that policy, but what they're doing is extreme, and I don't endorse that either. So, let's agree, first of all, that none of us like what's happening there. And you should be able to identify, you really, no matter who you are, should spend time looking at your own house and figuring out who's messing it up and be ready to say, we don't actually, we're not really down with the white ethno-nationalists and, whatever else. We're not really down with that. That's way too far. And we acknowledge that is a thing that is connected to our side and perceptions of our side.
Right.
And that's not me. Because immediately first of all, you build a commonality. So you have common ground now of we're not that.
And you're honest and you acknowledge, yes, there are.
Yeah. And you have honesty and you build a little bit of trust. Like, okay, those negative assumptions that are almost always worse than reality that you might have had about me now just got pulled back a little bit. And again, you can't expect reciprocity, but once both people start doing that, you're almost always going to have a great conversation across any divide, because besides, this is the kind of the most ethically challenging technique. Besides the fact that you've now built trust and you've pulled away from extremists, you've built commonality, you've also both cast yourself in a role of not extremist that you then have to live up to. This is called alter casting we talk about.
Right,
So usually in alter casting, you would cast the role on somebody else. Oh, Pete, you're a very reasonable man. How about we have a conversation? So now Pete wants to live up to be reasonable. So he's more reasonable than he would have been.
Right.
It's a little psychological trick. Well, in this kind of case, you can actually, I'm not an extremist. So now you have to live up to, you alter cast yourself.
Right.
I'm not an extremist. And so now you have to not be an extremist. So the second an extremist interpretation comes up, you kind of have put a social pressure on yourself not to live up to that.
Right.
And so it's kind of like this, just heaping piles of benefit to a conversation.
And it's so easy to do,
that.
too. Just call it extremist on your side. That's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
Be willing to say, yeah, my side can go too far and they're absolute lunatics and it's not good.
Yeah,
This
and
is what
don't
it
be
looks
afraid
like.
to call them lunatics or crazy. Right?
Right.
There's some utterly odious
or dangerous
behavior,
or whatever it is.
Odious, dangerous behavior. This is not me.
So, in that spirit, who do you think is like an extremist on the political left and who's kind of an extremist on the political right?
Well, I will point out, I'm not afraid to say things, but it is generally inadvisable to pick out extremists on the other side.
Yes.
Because that's clean up your
Because then
own
you're
house.
just like, you're
you
just
look
condemning
like you're
the other
picking
side.
enemies. I would tell you that anybody who is a hardened advocate of the social justice ideology or that's leaning fully into that is an extremist on the left, though. That is an extreme pole of left-wing social and political thought. And you can't go there. It's too
So
far.
are the social justice warriors the same people who also call themselves like Justice Democrats? Are
The
those the
Justice
same?
Democrats is a political organization that is built out of that, yes. I will
That's
I
what I
will
thought.
pin them. They are extremists. They are, in fact, in my opinion, attempting to pull an ideological coup on the Democratic Party that's going
Obama
well.
just spoke about that very
Yeah.
recently, and he caught mad shit from the same people.
Yep.
What did he say? I missed it.
Oh, he was talking about, it's best if I don't say it because I don't want to get Obama's words wrong, but people can look up. He said two statements, but one was very recently. I don't know. What's the date today? Todate's
The
the
16th.
16th. So it was just a couple of days ago he said it, so people can look at, they should watch it for themselves.
Yeah.
It's like on YouTube or something like that. All right, cool.
Yeah, it was about not leaning that it's not good to lean too heavily into the identity politics approach
And the activism.
and the activism for it, and that it goes too far, and that there are better means, better ways.
Yeah, and it's worth watching that yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that you can allow it to like impact you, obviously.
Yeah, as
and be
opposed to
able
me telling you what Obama said.
Right.
Yeah.
Listen to the man
Yeah,
instead.
listen to what he said.
Yeah. How do you, it's interesting that he gets in trouble for something like talking about activism when the universities are so like active. Like I don't want to condemn my own university, but I was telling you guys the other day about it's like the multicultural office of
Yeah, there's
like
cesspools of
inclusion and
activism.
they're cooked. They are heavily infiltrated on the whole. It's not a
And
good
it's been
scene.
institutionalized, and people, faculty in particular, administration, come to think that this is normative, and this is how normal people behave and normal people think about the world. It's not. It's a tight-knit ecosystem.
Yeah.
There's no, and the other thing is that this stuff is totally untethered to reality. It's purely ideological. Purely ideological.
Yeah,
the
every time I try
universities
to
have
talk
taken
to-
it up big time.
Yeah, go ahead. Liz.
Oh, I was just going to say, every time I try to talk to somebody who is like kind of a social justice person, I always find myself being called like some kind of
Nazi.
not Nazi in particular, but I
Grifter?
mean,
Moron?
I've been called, maybe moron, maybe I'm a Trumpette or something like that,
Right.
even though I don't actually support Trump at all, and a bunch of other
Some
stuff.
kind of bigot or something.
They
yeah.
get homophobe.
Right,
Have you gotten
exactly.
that yet?
No, I actually haven't gotten homophobe yet. That's,
Yeah.
I now I have like a goal, I guess.
Good. Homophobe.
It's not hard.
Cross that off the bucket list.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's not hard. Don't worry.
I don't know I don't know how to talk about them, and I think that's kind of what intrigued me so much about the book, was because I wanted to figure out how I can have conversations with people who I haven't been able to have conversations with, people who used to be really good friends of mine who have now been like captured by the wave of insanity that kind of took the 2016 election like by the throat and
Right.
kind of body slammed it to the ground, and I found myself in 2016 almost being like part of that,
Right.
almost getting caught up in that wave myself. And there were a couple of times where I was like, that I don't really know how I feel about guns, but I feel like maybe you shouldn't be able to have any kind of gun, that
And
kind of thing.
Just to, sorry to interrupt, but
No, you're fine.
and that's okay to not. It's okay to feel some way or not know how to feel and not have a position because you don't have enough evidence. And that's not only is that okay, that's how you couldn't possibly know about all of the anthropogenic global climate change, plastics.
Right.
And when someone says, I don't know about that, or I have a feeling about it, great, thanks for being honest. Thanks for not pretending to know something you don't know.
Right.
That's fantastic. We need to laud that behavior.
Yeah, I find very frequently that any time that I'm like, I don't really know about this, I might be wrong, it kind of makes the conversation a little bit better. But usually
Right.
the person I'm talking to is so entrenched that I
Okay.
just cannot.
And anybody who castigates you for that, in general, you don't need those people in your life. Like,
Right.
that's just toxic.
Yeah, I mean, those conversations are possible. They're really difficult.
They're
And
possible.
they're going to require you, frankly, to listen to a whole lot of shit you don't really want to hear.
Exactly.
And that's step one.
Right,
So
listening.
it's the beginning.
Listening.
It is. It's adopting, let people be wrong, listen to learn, and adopting a posture where that's the main thing that you're doing.
Right, exactly.
And let them talk.
And that's exactly that. So what he just said, sir, that's another bundle that we've. I talked about there are different bundles.
Yeah.
He just gave you one bundle.
Yeah.
Yeah, the next layer down is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, where they have something deeper going on. If they have reached a state that it's ideology and they're completely entrenched in it, something deeper is going on. There's either an emotional thing, which is probably fear. I think we for a wide variety of reasons. In 2017, I wrote a paper with Helen Pluckrose, and we called this phenomenon existential polarization that we're facing right now.
In Aereo magazine.
Yeah, people don't just believe. It's not just polarized. It's becoming more polarized because people believe that if the other side gets power, existential threats will come true.
Exactly.
And so our
that.
way of life will be destroyed. The planet will be destroyed. Rapists will be everywhere. Something,
Right.
some extreme, like an existential threat to our either civilization or species or multiple species. That's what's on the table, and that's fear. That's an emotional thing,
Right.
or it's an identity thing. They think that if they think otherwise, that they're going to be a bad person. Maybe
Right.
they only think they're going to be accused of being credibly accused
Right.
in the current milieu, but anyway, accused of being a bad person, and they don't really want to go anywhere near that. So the second suite of techniques to start getting into is if you can maintain that rapport and you can do a lot of that listening and learning and let them unload the poison, if you will, and draw out the poison. Just let them keep talking, let them get it out. If you get past that, then you can actually start trying. This is when you get to those master level techniques. You can start saying, I've been listening to you and I really hear you and I appreciate what you're saying. And we've reached a point now where I think there's more going on here. And you can eventually broach into that emotional conversation. If you do, I really would recommend that you read as a supplement to our book, the one from the Harvard Negotiation Project, Douglas Stone's Difficult Conversations. He has a whole thing about broaching the emotional conversation. He has a whole chapter about broaching the identity conversation. And really, go into that very seriously and say, I think that maybe you're motivated by a fear that if your political team doesn't get power or maintain power, that something really bad is going to happen. And if they acknowledge that, now you can start to explore that fear, and maybe you can, by the nature of the conversation, you can start to untangle that. And if it's, would it make you a worse person if you believe something other than that?
Right.
So if you believed, for example, that there are problems with race in our country and racism still, but that maybe critical race theory is not the best way to go about addressing them, that maybe it's not the most rigorous way, would that make you a bad person to believe that? And if they acknowledge that it would, now you're actually operating on an identity level,
Right.
and you can change the nature of the conversation.
And you never have to
that.
worry about people. People love to talk about what they believe. They love it.
They
you
love
never
to talk
have to
about who
worry
they are,
about,
too.
Huh?
They love to talk about who they are, too, or
That's
who they
exactly
believe they
correct.
are.
So you never have to, I can't ask them. No, they love it. They love it. Love it. They love
just
to be
kind of
listened
like
to.
allow them to kind of, like you were saying, unload.
And you cannot, during that process, you cannot push back, you cannot disagree, you cannot say, well, what about, if you're having them unload, and maybe you're not qualified to do it.
And then
it's like psychology stuff.
But you're just being a good friend. We talk about
you just
in the
have
book.
to hear it
and
out.
We
Allowing
talk
people
about,
to vent or something.
Yeah, we talk about using minimal encouragers, and we talk about calibrated questions.
Mm-hmm.
So a calibrated question is a how or a why question, which invites them. You can't just give a simple yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
So calibrated questions are, how would that work, or why do you think that? There's no. Yeah, I think there's a whole, and then, so we also talk about drawing out the poisons, just saying, so a minimal encourager from hostage negotiation, someone would say something, and you let them know, even the words, I hear you. People have written whole books about the words, I hear you. I hear you. And then just take the last piece of something they said, like, Mexican rapist, or whatever, whatever the Trump is, well,
right.
Because I'm trying to use stuff from the right as well.
Right.
So those... Again, it's bundled, and we published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal when we talked about how do you talk to a social justice warrior. Your first order of business is you have to listen.
Yeah.
And you have to believe.
Yeah, minimal encouragers is what they call that in hostage negotiations, and then they call it mirroring or something like that in the clinical psychology literature. I'd have to remember what that's called. But the idea there generally would be that they say, blah, 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 blah. And then you pick 2 or 3 keywords out of what they just said and you repeat it back to them, maybe as a question. Oh, your dad died. And then that automatically opens up that they're just going to they don't want there to be that vacuum there. And so they just talk more. The warning, and so then they say, whatever it happens to be, and you're like playing cards, and then they're like, whatever it is, and this is actually a technique that's used in psychology, in clinical psychology, to get people to speak more and to open up more. And so you can actually use it. It's called, like Pete said, minimal encouragers in the hostage negotiations literature. But you do have to be cautious. If people realize you're doing it, it becomes really annoying. It's not like insulting. It's just annoying. Like, oh, I know what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And they will close off. I can tell you, for example, a friend of mine has a therapist who is, I don't think, very good. And she does that technique to enough excess to where it's now been seen through.
Right.
And at that point, like I said, it becomes annoying. So you do have to use these things. They're not just like magic bullets. You do have to use them with finesse and care and practice them. But it is actually a great way to get somebody to keep opening up and keep giving you a little bit more.
Yeah, the calibrated questions, too, is key. I find myself in class, particularly the calibrated questions are good. But sometimes you want non-calibrated questions to just very Socratically, this, and this, no, boom, calibrated question. In the book, I don't know if I'd call it the core, but certainly the nucleation point right around the center is the Socratic method. It's just the key to this whole thing.
Yeah.
It's just indispensable.
Just asking questions and listening to people.
Asking targeted questions designed to figure out someone's epistemology and see if the reasons they have for the belief justifies the confidence they have in the belief.
So if I can only have these conversations like one-on-one and face-to-face, but people aren't...
Okay, go ahead. But you can have them...
Right, you can have them obviously absolutely anywhere. You just have to take care in the context in which you're having the conversation. But if they're the most effective, I guess,
they are the most effective
in face-to-face, one-on-one conversation, and people aren't really leaving their houses anymore to kind of have face-to-face conversation. Like we were talking last night, how the average 20-year-old has absolutely zero friends. Was that you and me who were talking about that? Yeah.
And then they have headphones on to prevent it from happening.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it's kind of like I'm unsure how I can accurately, or at least, I guess accurately is the right word, to accurately apply this in a social media space that would allow for the types of kind of innovation and conversation that we're looking for to kind of bridge the gap in political discourse. Is there any like particular advice you could give about social media other than taking care and realizing that you're reading text and you're not like seeing a person and their body language and
I have
their
a
tone?
couple of things, a few things. One is the thing I already mentioned. You can always try to invite it to become a one-on-one, even though text message or Facebook Messenger or whatever is not as good as face-to-face. You can always invite the conversation off of the public forum into the private one.
Right.
Maybe they say no, but it usually will go more productively. You can set up rules. One of the daughters of the guy who founded the Westboro Baptist Church left the church, and she found that actually having conversations online was very effective because you could read the thing, and the thing was upsetting, and they had an agreement that you weren't allowed to respond upset. So you read the thing and you become upset, and maybe it's 24 hours before you come back and you write your reply. And so you can set up a rule like that. So if you want to engage digitally, anywhere in the world, you can do that. We have a friend, Pamela Peresky, who's actually extraordinarily good at this. She's sort of, just by virtue of her personality, a living embodiment of her book. It's really kind of great. She's very good at actually just inviting people out into public spaces. So you can do that. Hey, I see that, you're also here in Colorado Springs. Let's go get coffee. We don't even have to talk about this. Let's just get to know each other a little bit better and see if you can get people out and doing things. That's all net good for everybody. Maybe they say no, and that's okay, no big deal. Or, let's meet on campus and, hang out, or let's, do something together. One of the ways, for example, that they've showed that breaks down, there have been, commercials have exploited this. There have been videos about it. There's research showing it. Almost every barrier between people can be broken down by generating a situation where there's shared goals. So let's go do a thing together. Like maybe we're going to go climb a mountain. Maybe we're going to, whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Anything.
Maybe that's competitive, but I'm trying to think of like a specific activity.
I mean, there's these commercials they did where they had people get together and put together a table.
Oh, the Heineken?
Yeah. And then drink a beer at the table. But they built the table and then they revealed to each other, you have this view that the other person would find horrendous, and they have this other, and you guys should hate each other. Do you still want to have the beer? And almost everybody said yes. And they became friends.
I've seen something on that.
Those commercials were genius.
And it taps into something real, is that shared objectives overcome difference. so you can actually invite people to go do something or try to organize things where people try to do things together and get people talking. Like, hey, we want to get people from different persuasions together, and we're not going to talk politics at all. We're going to, build a house for Habitat for Humanity or something.
Yeah.
Right.
And so anything where you do that, you can start breaking down those barriers.
Yeah.
So you can invite private conversation. You can try to get face-to-face conversation and invite people out of their bubble when it's, local enough. Or if you
I'll
have
give
to
a
be
little
traveling.
more cynical take. That was very lovely, by the way.
I mean, it's a thing.
No, it is a thing. And I would also say there are trolls. There are people with sock puppet accounts. You're owed nothing. You don't owe anybody a response.
That's
on
super
social.
important too. Yeah.
You don't owe anybody a response on social media. So if, and there are rules like, as Jim said, 2 or 3 times, take it to DMs. I have no problem muting somebody.
Me too. I have like 8,000 accounts muted on Twitter. It's like Pete said, you don't owe these people anything, first of all, because you put something on Twitter and they shot a reply back. So what,
Right.
Okay,
And then
whatever.
you have to know that each platform has its nuances. And so people, as we wrote in the book, often people don't post because they want a stimulating conversation. They post because they want their view affirmed.
Right.
Right.
Or
They want to
they're-
get likes, comments, retweets,
Yeah.
shares.
They're going for status. That might be in the virtue signaling thing, or they're going, actually, this is really common. All they're trying to do is vent the fact that your comment stimulated cognitive dissonance in them. And then they comment venting their dissonance, and then that might trigger dissonance in you, and you snap back, and then now you
Right.
get like this losing spiral.
Right.
It's just really easy to, on social media, especially on something like Twitter, where it's just this morass of who knows who. Unless you have something built with the person, you don't actually have to reply to them.
Right.
You don't even have to
You
look
owe
at
them
your
nothing.
replies.
You don't owe
And if you-
anybody anything on social media.
If it's somebody who writes to you in a harsh way or without, the right kind of approach, when you say tweet, you're actually broadcasting, right? And so your tone can be however you want to broadcast. If people throw trash back at you for it, you actually don't have to, you're broadcasting. If it was the radio, you wouldn't hear them yelling at the radio in the car. You don't have to listen to that. I the other day was talking about all this work I've done, blah, 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 blah. This is one that just sticks out in my mind. So whoever did it, that little, I'm probably troll. I don't know. If they hear this, they'll be happy because I remember them. They got muted immediately. I'd said, based on like several years of research, I just keep getting drawn back to this conclusion, and I keep trying to get away from it, and I keep getting pulled back to it. And the guy wrote back, watching a bunch of YouTube videos doesn't count as research. Mute. That's it. Anybody who wants to engage with me that way, gone. I'll never hear from him again.
Right.
And that you're perfectly within your rights to do that, to protect your own sanity, to prevent yourself from getting radicalized by believing the world is this terrible place. Because, people on Twitter, I don't know if you've met a lot of people from Twitter in real life, but they're not really representative of the overall society. I even saw a statistic the other day that somebody shared. I think Claire Lemon shared it. That 80% of Twitter users are like middle or upper middle class millennials. Nice, nice picture of society there, right? Nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that particular demographic.
What's Ruben's
But
bio?
but
Twitter is not real life.
It is not real life. What was the article in the Atlantic? The problem isn't Twitter; it's that you take Twitter seriously.
Right.
Right.
It's you don't know if the person replying to you, I don't mean to sound really cynical or get into any weird debates. You don't know if that person's a bot. You don't know if it's a troll account that's set up by some organization that just goes and politically agitates.
Right.
You don't know if it's a paid harasser. There are people who do that.
There are paid harassers.
There are people.
That's
There are activists who hire people to go and harass people that are saying things they don't want said on social media because it makes their social media
That was a
experience
huge
negative.
light bulb for me.
And then
That
once
reminds me of Happy Gilmore.
it's a way to get people to shut up. You just wear
Right.
them out by giving them crap, and they're like, I don't want to deal with the crap anymore, and they quit talking.
Right.
It's actually you can read about
Chill
it.
speech.
You can read about it in like almost any one of the handbooks for how to do radical activism is like wear out your opponents by harassing them. And so you don't know who it could be. A troll. It could be a 14-year-old boy who's just bored and trying to stir up trouble, trying to get a reaction out of
Like the
somebody.
South Park episode, did you see where the guys was it Kyle's dad was the main troll for the town. Did you see that episode?
No,
Yeah, you saw that? Yeah, it was really good. So like I think that you need to put these things into proper perspective.
Yeah. So the thing is, there is, engage how you want in these different forums, but also realize that there's a good chance you're taking it more seriously than you need to. My rule of thumb on Twitter that I've actually for several months now been very good at maintaining is if I'm not having fun on the platform, just get off of it. Do something different. And I think that's a general rule for social media. Everybody should be holding. The second somebody sends you that comment and you get like tunnel vision, like it's not time to respond.
Yeah.
It's maybe mute them or whatever. It's now time to turn off the computer.
Right.
Put your phone in a different room and do something different. Put your phone, plug it in, and who does this anymore? Go outside without your phone. I know a lot of people that do this the first time. You go on a hike, don't bring your phone. You feel naked in tremendous danger.
Right.
Or drive to the store without your phone. People are like, but what if I get in a wreck?
Who am I gonna call?
Everybody else has a phone. You'll be okay.
Right.
So,
exactly.
Just plug your phone in a different physical space than where you are. Anywhere you hit the I'm no longer having fun, somebody's wrong on the internet and it's pissing me off, or if you're getting dogpiled on the internet, just go away from it. It's really hard to do, but just go away from it. And if you go outside, you get in nature or whatever is one of the things you can do, or whatever. About 50 to 90 minutes later, you will break that rumination cycle completely. And then it's no longer, you're like, why did I care about that? And then you don't have to go back to it, or you can in a different frame of mind.
Right.
I was in the green room with this guy a couple of weeks ago, and he was a pro fighter, and evidently he got knocked out in one of his fights. And he said that he was dogpiled on Twitter. Oh, you're a punching bag, and you're a loser, and you can't. And he said that what was interesting about that is that not a single, he was in the UFC, not a single person ever said that to his face. And I thought that was really interesting.
Right, because people have so much more courage behind a keyboard. When
And very rarely do people give me shit to my face. My colleagues.
Right.
Accepted, but
Maybe colleagues and friends.
right, but no.
Oh, God.
Very rarely is that. It's almost always under the guise of something else, particularly anonymity.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a thing I saw recently, and I don't know the depth of or validity of it yet, but it talked about how something like 80% of the, and this is kind of Pareto rule for you nerds out there, the 80% of the bad acting, the tension and the anger on social media is caused by the worst 15%
I bet you that's about
of
right,
users. Yeah. It's the same with driving, it turns out. The something like, I forget what, 75%, I forget the actual proportions, but it's close to this 80-20 Pareto principle rule. 80% of traffic fatalities are caused by the 20% most aggressive drivers, and most people aren't actually the problem. There's a small proportion, and what they actually were talking about with social media is that in addition to that, there's this a corollary effect of that is that people expect bad behavior on social media, so they react in a bad way in response to it. So, if you go on social media and you're like, oh, I know I'm going to get trashed today, or somebody's going to make some smart ass comment, I think social media is actually a deconstruction machine. And you put anything into it, and it's like the blob, it eats it and dissolves it.
Right.
You can't put like a picture of like your house and somebody's just like, oh, well, you have, it's like immediately.
Your house sucks.
Yeah, exactly. Like, why did you get that? That's immoral. Where are your solar panels? Whatever the hell it is. And it's just, it's like negative. But so you end up having psychologically a defensive posture yourself.
Right.
And you're just that much more likely to come back with iron and anger against people rather than with, interest or compassion or whatever. This is one of the reasons in general, and I'll just own it right now. I'm terrible for that. Once you cross a certain number, 10, 12,000 followers on Twitter, your life is so miserable because of that the only way that you can keep your sanity, unless you're a saint, which I'm not, is to have this like kind of flippant posture, or kind of do like Pete does, and Pete doesn't really interact on Twitter. It's like you kind of have two choices. If you're going to engage, you've got to almost have like your shell on. But it's good to take that off and just get away from the whole thing and not take that conversation on social media so seriously.
Right.
So a few points there. one, I bet you, I don't know this, I've not seen any data for this, but I am almost positive that within that 80-20, there's another 80-20.
That's the Pareto principle. Is always another 80-20 inside the.
But I'm specifically talking about in this context of Twitter and social media. There are a small number of people who literally must not have day jobs.
Yeah.
And they just
or their day job is paid harasser.
Yeah, literally. And I mean, we can tell you off camera
out
how we know this and who some of these people are. But what's really interesting about that is that many of those people have sock puppets, and like Jim said, once you start getting over a certain number of followers, that I've definitely seen they've tweeted from the wrong accounts when I've been engaging people, and it almost makes it impossible to engage people because you don't know who is a bad actor, you don't know who is, the sock puppet. It's just not
very difficult.
Yeah, and so any kind of, and when you do engage them, it's like after 2 or 3 tweets, it's always the same. It's I shouldn't say always, 99% of the time it's the same. It's some like low-level grief. But anyway, so back to that, I just think you have to look at the platform for what it is and not take it as, oh, it's not real life.
Right.
And don't take it as real life.
Right.
Yeah. So use it as, I think, an opportunity to find conversations and try to have them, if we want to circle back to the book,
Right.
by inviting people into a private space or into a private environment where you can have a conversation, even if that's in public, so direct messages, private messaging, or let's go get coffee together, or to try to organize like, hey, let's go do something productive together and see what comes out of it. And maybe we'll come back to this conversation after that. Let's get to know each other a little bit.
Yeah, let's build some rapport first.
Well, yeah. And let's get to know each other as humans and see if, as opposed to as avatars with, anime cartoons or whatever, they're yelling at each other.
Twitter eggs.
Yeah. Well, nobody has eggs anymore. So you have to think of something different.
Yeah.
The egg is gone.
Yeah.
The egg is gone. All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good conversation about the book. Did you guys have anything in particular that you wanted to add about it?
That you can get it pretty much anywhere fine books are sold.
On Amazon for $15.
Amazon. If you and Jim and I are starting something called New Discourses, and a website will be out soon. And
yeah, that should come out soon.
Yeah, we won't reveal too much about that now. But if you want to find me on Twitter, at Peter Boghossian, PeterBoghossian, and if you want to find Jim,
I'm at Conceptual James.
All right, awesome. I really appreciate you guys coming out. This has been fantastic.
Cool.
Yeah,
looking forward to the event tonight.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that as well. I think it's going to be a good time.
Cool.
All right, thanks, guys.
Awesome.